It's 1865, and the Civil War has finally ended. But it has been a long and bloody conflict. Thousands of American men are dead, others are permanently disfigured or injured as a result of conflict. The South has been destroyed, most of its major cities burnt to the dirt, its lands depopulated of people. There are refugees moving everywhere. Millions of African Americans are moving about the South, and no one's exactly sure of their status. Are they still slaves? Are they now free as a result of the Emancipation Proclamation? And to add to this chaos, the President of the United States has been assassinated. This is the first time a president has been assassinated. Now, some presidents have been shot at prior to this. Someone actually attempted to assassinate Andrew Jackson twice, but Lincoln is the first American president to be killed in office, triggering his vice president, Andrew Johnson, to become the next president. And so, in a time of chaos and transition, this country now has to decide, how do we put things back together again? How do we get Southerners back into the Union and assure their loyalty? How do we deal with all of these people who have been enslaved their entire life and might now be free? How do we maintain their freedom? Do we give them freedom? How do we prepare them for freedom? What sets them up for success? These are all questions that the American government has to answer. And the period in which they try to make their way through this, we call Reconstruction, because we are reconstructing the country. Now, I told you, and I tell you all the time in class, that most time periods don't have distinctive dates. They kind of blend in and out of each other. Reconstruction has a distinctive set of dates. It lasts from 1865 to 1877. We have very tight dates on this one. So it's best to talk a little bit about what things went well during Reconstruction, its successes, and what things maybe did not go so well. And we're going to start with what things historians typically say went right during Reconstruction. So the things that we consider to be successful, even if they were only successful in the short term. So one of the major successes of Reconstruction is, in fact, that we do get all of those former Confederate states back into the Union. So we do get all of these states to agree to our terms to come back into the Union. Now, this is done through what we call military Reconstruction or radical Reconstruction. This was not based on the plan Lincoln had. Remember, Lincoln dies. His plan never goes into place. And President Johnson had actually put forward his own plan and had brought some states back into the Union. But Congress rejected that plan when they realized that too many former Confederates had gotten back into Congress and that the South was reasserting its claim to its slaves. The North very quickly decides that slavery is going to end, that the Civil War, that is the point. The Civil War is ending slavery. And so during military Reconstruction, the South is divided up into major military districts and is placed under martial law. The military is there, keeping the peace and ensuring that newly freed slaves are allowed to be free, and that former Confederates aren't planning any future rebellions. Not everyone in the South is happy that the war is over, and they're not happy in the way it's turned out. Each of these districts are then subdivided into even smaller districts within each state. And so that's why if you're ever doing a genealogical work in the South and you get back into this period, really up until the early 1900s, county lines suddenly get really weird. And they change a lot in the period between about 1865 and 1900. And suddenly your ancestors may be living in military district, whatever. That's a result of this conflict. It is a result of this time period in the subdivision where they kind of break down in many areas the original county lines, and those counties are kind of lumped together into bigger military districts. So if you're looking at the 1870 census, and really even though Reconstruction's over, the 1880 census, you will frequently find military districts listed in place of counties. We don't know what would happen in the 1890 census because we can't read the 1890 census, but that's a different story entirely. By the 1900 census, most of the military districting has gone away in the South, and we start to see the reestablishment of counties, although sometimes with different names. So this really does play havoc if you're working with like old census records and trying to trace families through this time period. Because you guys know Dr. Stevenson loves to stalk dead people. Stalking dead people was made excessively hard by military Reconstruction. But it is successful at bringing peace to the South, in keeping the South from having another rebellion, and in giving Black people the ability and the space to become free and to exercise their new rights. Another thing that we usually point out that at least initially we get right during Reconstruction is creating organizations like the Freedmen's Bureau. So the Freedmen's Bureau was created to help newly freed slaves navigate freedom. So its job was providing schools, and that's where it's most successful. It sets up schools all over the South and sends teachers, good teachers, to staff these schools so that newly freed slaves can get an education. It will ultimately help set up a number of historically Black colleges and universities across the South, many of which still exist today, actually get their start during this time period with the help of the Freedmen's Bureau. So all of a sudden, we have a population that's now becoming literate. The Freedmen's Bureau also helped newly freed slaves negotiate labor contracts and find work because you need a job. And so the Freedmen's Bureau was there to make sure that you weren't being taken advantage of and that you understood the terms of your labor contracts. It also helped slaves get access to land, to purchase land for themselves, to settle, to farm, to become farmers. Now, as it was originally brought up, the Freedmen's Bureau wasn't just supposed to help newly freed slaves. It was actually also supposed to help poor white people living in the South. So the original intent was to not only help slaves, but to help poor whites also get access to an education. There was not much of a public school system in the South at this point. The South has always lagged on public education. But most white people don't take advantage of it because they're still so bitter about the end of the Civil War that they do not take advantage of a program that actually could have helped them a lot, the same as it helped many African Americans. Another thing that we usually say is right about Reconstruction are those three Reconstruction amendments. And you do need to know these amendments for the AP exam. They are very important. Some of the most important amendments in our Constitution after the Bill of Rights. The 13th Amendment ends slavery. And in a minute, we'll talk about the loophole in the old 13th Amendment. But the 13th Amendment, on paper at least, ends slavery, forced servitude. So we have now put something in our Constitution saying people cannot be property, with the exception of that little loophole. The 14th Amendment is equally important. The 14th Amendment outlines really what it means to be a citizen of the United States and what rights you have with regards to the law. So this has our due process of the law clause in it. This amendment is important because in that earlier Dred Scott ruling in the 1850s, the Supreme Court had ruled that Black people were not citizens, regardless of whether they were slaves or not. So the 14th Amendment is outlining really what it means to be an American citizen. It's giving that citizenship back to Black people and promising that regardless of your race, you have certain rights that have to be upheld by the government. You have certain rights and a certain expectation of treatment under the law. And finally, the third is the 15th Amendment. The 15th Amendment grants Black men the right to vote. It does not grant women the right to vote. Women will not get the right to vote for a little bit longer. So by the time we get to the 15th Amendment, race can no longer be used as a reason to keep someone from voting. Now, gender can be, but not race. So the 15th Amendment gives all men over the age of 21 the right to vote. 18-year-olds aren't voting yet, and women are not voting yet. And the 15th Amendment is going to be a major, major blow to the women's rights movement in many respects because they had expected to be included in this and were not. So these three amendments passed during this period sort of lay the groundwork for creating a society that would have been a more equal society. Now, you know, because you've taken this whole class or you know anything about US history, that's not what happened. We had a whole civil rights movement in the 1950s and 60s. So clearly, we set up all this stuff, we put all this stuff in place for things to be okay. But clearly, something went tragically wrong somewhere along the lane of time that this stuff didn't take effect. And so now we're going to transition. We're talking a little bit about why Reconstruction was ultimately a failure. It does lay a nice groundwork, but it does not ultimately achieve what was necessary during that time period. Reconstruction is, most historians will tell you now, a failure. The only thing it succeeded in was bringing the South back into the Union, and it does lay this sort of groundwork, but it fails to complete the job. It fails for a variety of reasons. One is that it just simply does not last long enough, but another is because there is a period of time right after the war ends when the United States is still figuring out what to do, and there's some fumbling in the first 2 years after the Civil War. And that gives the South time to rethink this conflict and to come up with their own answers for why things are happening to them the way that they are. We call this the lost cause. So initially, and you have to remember that during the Civil War, Americans were extremely religious on both sides. Lincoln even says at one point, both sides believe that God is on their side, but God can't be on both sides of this argument. Somebody has to be wrong. And when this war ends, we'll find out which one of us was actually wrong about the morality of slavery. Well, the South unequivocally loses this conflict. And they now have to question what was the deal? Like, were we wrong? And there is this brief period when Southerners are intensely confused and they're asking themselves, were we wrong? Was all those abolitionists right? Did this terrible thing happen to us because slavery is morally wrong? And some historians argue that had the North struck hard with Reconstruction and really exploited that religious fear that God was angry with the South and the South had done something morally wrong, that Reconstruction might have gone better. Might have, we don't really know. But they don't. They don't exploit that fear, and that gives Southerners a time to rethink it. They come up with something that we now call the lost cause. It's basically a weird attempt to rewrite all of history. It's initially posited by a Christian minister who posits the idea to his congregation and then later in an essay to a broader audience that perhaps this is not a punishment. Perhaps the Civil War and what's happening with Reconstruction isn't God punishing the South because they were wrong. What if the South wasn't wrong at all, but God is just testing them? Just testing Southerners to see if they will remain true to their values. What if they've been right about slavery this whole time? What if it is divinely ordained that it should be? And the South just has to outlast the North. Now, if you're in the South, this is an appealing idea because it suddenly makes you not the bad guy anymore. And it runs like wildfire. And Southerners begin completely rewriting their own history to reflect a history that didn't really exist in the South. So this is where we start seeing the creation of the myth of the happy slaves on their plantation, and no plantation owner ever treated their slaves bad. Slaves liked being slaves. In fact, they don't like being free because they were treated so well as slaves. Like, nobody ever beat their slaves. There were never people escaping slavery. It was just these jealous Northerners who were jealous of all the divine blessings that Southerners got. And Southerners fought valiantly in the war, and that has to be remembered. And so the lost cause leads to the construction of all of these weird statues all over the South that are now currently in the news. So if you've been looking around in the news and you've seen them like removing all of these weird Confederate statues, and you saw like angry people with the Confederate battle flag going, they're erasing our history. But you haven't seen a lot of historians get on there to argue we're erasing history. It's because those statues represent a history that never actually existed. They represent a fantasy that Southerners entertained after the Civil War of a past that wasn't real. Nothing about it was real. It was a fantasy they were living in to help them feel better about losing a war. So those statues do not in any way represent any sort of factual history of what happened in the Southern War effort or in the antebellum years. It really is more a monument to a fantasy that the South engaged in and many Southerners still continue to engage in today. And the problem has become that the lost cause made it into textbooks. The South was very selective, and textbook companies made textbooks that parroted things that the Southerners were already saying in the lost cause. So many people of a certain age grew up reading in textbooks things like slavery wasn't bad and that it was really all about states' rights, even though historians even then knew it wasn't true. So if you ever encounter an older person who's like, but I remember back in high school when they are a product of a broken education system. And these statues in no way, shape, or form reflect a real history. And that's why you don't really see any historians out there going, we must not erase it because we know this isn't real. It in any form, shape, or fashion. But Southerners really rally around this lost cause. And because the idea is that the South's being tested, they realize that they can't change their lifestyle. And so they begin to look for ways to return the South to the status quo, to, to return it to slavery. And there, the 13th Amendment helps them because there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says you can't force a person to work against their will without pay. But there's an unless in there, unless they've been convicted of a crime. So it is perfectly legal under the 13th Amendment to make somebody who's been convicted of a crime work off their crime. And so what we suddenly start to see in the South is a proliferation of laws, racial laws that really target Black people and also some poor whites. Everything suddenly gets criminalized in the South so that they can gather up a workforce. This is where we start to see the beginnings of the chain gangs, the convict leasing. These are things in which somebody gets arrested and they get sentenced to work so many years, either for the state or even in the event of convict leasing, where you are leased out to a private farmer to do whatever they say you have to do. It is, as one historian pointed out, slavery by another name. And you may get a high sentence for a relatively stupid crime. You jaywalked, you're suddenly doing 2 years on the chain gang. So this really reinstitutes slavery on some levels. Another way that we're going to start to see this is through economics. White Southerners have no vested interest in seeing Black people doing well at this point. And so what we quickly start to see is wealthy white Southerners trying to get their agricultural labor force back. They're going to do this through something called sharecropping. What they're going to do is they're going to go to their former slaves, hand to poor white people living nearby, and they're going to say, I'll make a deal with you. You keep living right here where you've been living with your family. And I will supply you with tools and with seeds, and you will go out and you will do all the farming labor. And when you sell the crop, when you harvest it, we will take it to market and sell it. And you and I will split, we will share the income. We will share the crop. That's why we call it crop sharing or sharecropping. The problem with that is particularly if you're an illiterate person, you may not read all of the parts of that contract. And during the year, while you're waiting on that crop to grow, you're going to need things. Your family's going to need food. You might need clothes or medicine for one of your children. And the person who owns the property is going to come to you and say, I'll give you this and you can pay me off when we sell the crop. And so throughout the year, you're going to be getting things from this person. Now, what most sharecroppers found is that when it came time to settle up at the end, somehow not only did the crop sell for less than they thought it should, they suddenly don't have enough money to pay the half that the landowner is supposed to receive and to pay for all those extras they've gotten throughout the year, which means they have to promise to stay another year and work that off through an extended sharecropping thing. Sharecropping becomes a pit that people can't get out of because somehow or other, you are never out of debt to the landowner. And that's because he's cooking the books. This is something that traps not just uh, former slaves, it's also going to trap a lot of poor white people. Because now that slavery is over and rich white people no longer need poor white people to back them up, they no longer need poor white people. And so they don't treat them very well anymore. So lots of poor white people also get stuck in this. Sharecropping was still quite common in the South as late as the 1970s and early 1980s. There were still people who were essentially caught in slavery, just by another name, as late as the 1980s, working off debts that they owed to people. If you incurred any other type of debt, though, you could also be made to work that off. So you got a fine or you borrowed money from somebody. This is called peonage when we make someone work to work off their debt. And what many of the people who got caught in this found is that somehow they just never worked off their debts. Much like sharecropping, they just never managed to work off their debt to a county, a city, or a loan officer. So these little loopholes allowed white Southerners to kind of reinstitute slavery in many respects. They're also going to move quite legally at the time to keep Black people from exercising their right to vote. Setting of individual voting laws and setting up precincts, when you guys get into AP Gov, you'll learn that that's all handled by states. And states can regulate who gets the right to vote within them. So they can say things like, if you've been convicted of a felony, you can't vote. It's actually quite legal. If you're not a resident of the state, you can't vote. If you don't have a valid ID, you can't vote. These things are all, we can argue about the morality of them or the equity of them, but these are all things that states under the Constitution are actually allowed to do. So what happens in the South is we start to see them developing laws that target uh, specifically African Americans. So we have things like grandfather clauses, which says if your grandfather wasn't eligible to vote in 1860, you can't vote. There wasn't a single Black person in the South whose grandfather was eligible to vote in 1860, so boom, you can't vote. Now that does get struck down pretty quickly by the Supreme Court. The South comes back with two more that are much harder to strike down. One is a poll tax. They simply said to vote, you must pay a tax, and that tax goes to cover how much money it costs to run an election. It costs money to run an election, to have people there to count ballots, to print the ballots, to get stuff processing. And so many states said, okay, well, people should pay a small fee to help cover that when they go to vote. Perfectly legal, but also if you're poor, really deprives you of your right to vote. Another voting trick being used in the South was literacy tests. So you had to prove you could read to vote. Now, on the surface, we'd probably at a time when we don't have news sources of people talking and people get most of their news and information on issues through newspapers, if a person can't read, are they really informed enough to vote? What a lot of people found, though, when you went in to take these little literacy tests is that they were super confusing and they don't make much sense. And often, white people are given much easier reading, something from the Bible that even if they weren't fully literate, it's probably a scripture they had already memorized. And so when they saw or heard the heading, they already knew what it was about and they could jumble out enough of it to prove that they were literate, even if they weren't. But African Americans are always given much harder readings, some of them that have different types of instructions that are extremely confusing, and they can't ask for clarification. Or they might be given a part of a state's constitution to read. And that's hard to read even if you are into reading old-timey legalese. Talking to somebody who spent years reading 18th century legalese. It's not always easy and straightforward to understand, even if you do know what you're doing, much less if you're not super educated. So some people are deprived of their right to vote simply because they allegedly can't read, even though what they've been given is perfectly unintelligible gibberish. The South is also going to reinstitute a series of what we now call the Jim Crow laws. These are laws that establish racial segregation in the South, segregating of white from Black people. Now, people do test this, and in the 1890s, in Plessy versus Ferguson, the Supreme Court, and another dark day for the Supreme Court, guys, actually rules that racial segregation is perfectly legal, provided that the accommodations offered to each group are equal. Now, it will be the 1950s before people managed to prove that those equal facilities were essentially never actually equal. So, all the time that Reconstruction is going on in the South, Southerners are finding ways to circumvent it, to keep the status quo in place, to keep people in a condition of slavery, to keep them from exercising their right to vote. And eventually, in the election of 1876, they're going to get something they really want, which is the removal of the troops from the South. The troops in the South are the ones who are still enforcing some level of civility between white people and black people and keeping black people from being the targets of violence. The South wants these hated federal troops gone. They want home rule again. During the election of 1876, it is a contested election, and there are widespread allegations of voter fraud, particularly in Florida. It's always Florida, guys. It is always Florida. Just like in the 2000 election, there was an issue counting the ballots in Florida, but also in several other states. The election came down, and the Electoral College went to vote, and the Electoral College was basically like, we don't know how to vote because these 5 states can't certify their elections. And we can either redo these elections or we can just bump this problem off to Congress and let Congress decide. And so Congress now has to decide between 2 candidates: Tilden, who is a Democrat from the South, and Rutherford B. Hayes, the Republican from the North. Congress actually votes extensively, and they also can't reach a decision on who to name president. So eventually they name a committee to make a decision. This committee was made up of 14 members, 7 of which were Republicans, 6 of which are Democrats, and one of them is an independent. Now, he is a Republican leaning independent at this point, but one of them is more of an independent. And they are tasked with figuring this out. Now, Hayes needs all of the contested votes to win. Tilden actually was much closer to winning the Electoral College. But Hayes actually goes around to the Southern Democrats and he says, look, if you give me the election, I will remove the troops from the South. I'll end Reconstruction. Southern Democrats are like, Tilden, you were our boy, but this dude's going to end Reconstruction. So we're going to give him the election. So we can talk later about corruption. But essentially, Hayes becomes the next president. And in 1877, as he promised, he removes all of the federal troops from the South, completely ending Reconstruction and also ending any chance that Black people had of any sort of equality during this era. Because as soon as those troops are gone, we see a massive surge in violence, particularly racial violence in the South. By the 1890s, one year in the 1890s, Black people were lynched every single day for the entire year. Violence becomes appallingly high during this era without federal troops. But America has kind of shifted its attention and it's already looking toward its second industrial revolution, a much bigger industrial revolution. So the problems that are occurring here in the South, we're really going to put off dealing with them largely until the 1950s. So we're going to stop there. In our next video, we're going to start talking about America's second industrial revolution. We'll also be starting a new unit at that point.